My name is Lena Whitaker, and at 42, I didn't just lose a house. I watched my entire childhood get bulldozed at 5:12 in the morning with a single gut punch text. They're tearing it down. Just 2 weeks earlier, I was sipping tea in my tiny apartment, believing time had simply moved on. That my past, however bittersweet, was safe in memory. I should have known better. Congressman Everett Clarke, the same man who once wept on our block about preserving tradition, was behind it. I drove barefoot in pajama pants, heart slamming against the wheel, only to find my family home reduced to rubble. And a sign planted in its grave, Clarke Heritage Pavilion, preserving our proud past. My past was under that dust. My father's last breath, my mother's pie, my brother's promise, gone. If you think I lit candles and let it go, you don't know me. Before we dive in, hit like and subscribe if you've ever had something stolen and weren't allowed to grieve. Now let me take you back to the moment they erased me and how I made them remember. They didn't just bulldoze my house. They scraped the marrow out of my childhood and posted a sign in its place. I got the message at 5:12 in the morning, just a missed call from Mrs. Grant across the street, too old now to stand in protest, but not too old to send a single line that split me open. They're tearing it down. No address, no explanation, just that. And somehow, I knew exactly what she meant. I didn't brush my teeth. I didn't change clothes. I drove barefoot in pajama pants, like a woman possessed, heart beating against the steering wheel as if it wanted to reach the demolition site before I could. When I turned onto Sycamore Hollow, the street where I scraped my knees learning to ride a bike, I saw them. Hard hats, machines, dust. And behind them, a tall, freshly printed wooden sign that made my blood turn to ice. Future site of Clarke Heritage Pavilion, preserving our proud past. My past was under that rubble. The porch where my father used to hang colored lights each Christmas. The kitchen where my mother burned her first pie and cried over it like it was a funeral. The bedroom where my brother and I once built a tent out of blankets and made promises we were too young to understand. My father died in that house. My mother taught me how to stand my ground in that house. I left for college with a suitcase and a kiss on that doorstep. And now it was nothing but splinters. The man behind the project was none other than Congressman Everett Clarke. He stood on this very block last year, hand over heart, making teary-eyed speeches about tradition and community, about how some places carry the soul of a town. Apparently, he didn't mean mine. I screamed, louder than I had in years, pointing at the pile of brick and bone that used to be my world. There's still history under there. A construction worker didn't even look at me, just shrugged and muttered, "Not anymore." My voice cracked. My knees shook, but no tears came. Just a steady burn in my chest and a whisper that slid out like a vow sealed in iron. They can bury the bricks, but I'll unearth the truth. I filed 3 petitions. Not angry letters, not protest signs. Just carefully documented pleas backed with photos, birth records, and zoning maps. The first was misdirected to the wrong office. The second came back stamped in red. Insufficient legal grounds for historic preservation. The third? It was never acknowledged. I called, followed up, even walked the envelope to the municipal building myself. I watched the clerk drop it into a tray with a tight-lipped smile and eyes that didn't meet mine. It never made it to the docket. When they scheduled the town council meeting, I was the first to arrive, and the last to be heard. I brought black and white photographs from 1957. My father in uniform standing on our porch. My mother baking bread with the window open behind her. I brought the original street map, inked by hand, showing our lot as one of the first homes built after the war. I even held up my brother's birth certificate, issued at that very address. One councilman looked at the evidence, then leaned back with a smirk and said, "We're building something bigger now." Even the old oak tree behind our yard, the one with roots thick as railroad ties, the one where the town's veteran circle met in secret during the years when nobody else would hear them, was chopped down in the name of new planning. I wasn't even notified. I only found out when I drove by and saw a man with an orange vest standing knee-deep in sawdust, holding a chainsaw like a scalpel. The final blow came when they started digging into the brick foundation, right where my father and I had buried the time capsule he carried through Normandy. Inside was the watch he wore under fire, a folded letter from my grandmother with ink faded like breath, and the metal he never wanted anyone to make a fuss about. I begged them. "Just 30 minutes," I said. "Let me unearth it before you tear through it." The foreman didn't even pause. "It's just old junk, ma'am," he said, and turned away like he hadn't just stepped on someone's heartbeat. That night, I returned, not to fight, just to witness what was left of everything I once called home. I stood in the dark, surrounded by broken stone and the bitter silence of a town that didn't care. No neighbor knocked. No local paper ran the story. No one said they were sorry. I used to believe I was part of this place's history. But that night, I finally understood. They didn't just demolish my home. They deleted my existence from the town's memory. Up until this point, they thought I'd give up, that I'd grieve and disappear. But what would you do if your entire past was paved over like it never mattered? Keep watching, because this is where I stop mourning and start fighting back. I wasn't confused. I wasn't nostalgic. I was furious, and I had nothing left to lose. I returned to the small apartment I'd been renting, bare walls, mismatched mugs, a place that never felt like mine, and sat cross-legged in the corner, where an old trunk of my mother's had gathered dust for years. Inside, beneath newspaper clippings and crumbling recipes, I found it. The original 1913 zoning map of our town. Faded, water-stained, but still legible. That's when I saw it. A small parcel of land labeled Sycamore Hollow, state-protected historic battlefield site. My hands trembled. I'd never heard anyone mention that name in my entire adult life. I opened my laptop, searched Google Maps. Nothing. I entered the coordinates manually, cross-referencing with the layout from the map. And there it was, right beneath the Clarke Plaza parking lot, 5 acres of silent pavement where teenagers now loiter and security guards patrol. Used to be a protected piece of American soil. Vanished. Paved over. Forgotten. Except by me. I called Lila, a college friend who once worked in the county archives. Her voice caught when I mentioned the name. Sycamore Hollow? You're only the second person to ask about that in a decade. The first was Raymond Clarke. That was the match that lit the fuse. I dove headfirst into public records, scrolling through rezoning motions, dusty council minutes, and grainy microfilm copies of old legal notices. In 2006, Sycamore Hollow had been quietly reclassified as land for strategic redevelopment, buried in the footnotes of an emergency mid-year vote. The motion, introduced by then-Councilman Clarke. I stayed up through the night, not crying, not panicking, just writing, charting timelines, pinning years against each other like witnesses in an investigation. The groundbreaking of Clarke Plaza, the erasure of Sycamore from city maps, the formation of a shell company named Civic Revive LLC under Clarke's wife's maiden name. Every date was a cut, clean, surgical, and with each one, the grief inside me calcified into something sharper. By dawn, I had already purchased a domain name, thisusourhistory.org. The first line I typed onto its homepage wasn't flowery or poetic. It was a scalpel. This town doesn't need another plaque. It needs the truth. I started reaching out. A group of independent archaeologists from a nearby university. A local documentarian who'd once filmed a project on erased neighborhoods. A team of law students known for challenging dubious heritage claims. They answered. They showed up. We began to plan. Restore the real records of Sycamore Hollow. Track the financial paper trail of Civic Revive. Recover contracts that had mysteriously disappeared from the clerk's office. And, most importantly, craft a documentary that would shatter the illusion Clarke had spent decades building, scheduled to air in full glory on the very day he planned to cut the ribbon at his so-called Heritage Pavilion. He stole the past to build a monument to himself. I was about to turn it into his tombstone. You've seen the spark, now watch the fire spread. Because what I discovered next didn't just connect the dots. It blew the entire lie wide open. And trust me, you're going to want to see where this trail leads. I didn't need to knock on his door. I had documents sharp enough to slice through his career. With the law students I'd brought together, we began following the paper trail behind Civic Revive LLC. What we uncovered was more than suspicious. It was surgical. Over 12 years, that shell company had quietly acquired 6 historically protected properties, each one rezoned under the guidance of a planning committee Clarke himself had helped create. The evidence wasn't hidden. It was camouflaged. In fine print, in footnotes, in meetings without quorum that somehow moved millions. I hired a forensic accountant, quiet, methodical, relentless. She traced funds labeled community development right back into construction firms that Clarke's wife had discreet ties to. The kicker? 2 identical transactions. One dated the same day Clarke signed the demolition order for my family's house. The other, a lump sum wired to a personal account in his wife's name. I printed everything. 3 maps showing Sycamore Hollow's status as a state-protected site before it was reclassified. Testimonies from former planning board staffers who claimed Clarke personally instructed them not to record minutes from a closed-door session where the protective clauses were erased. Pages of wire transfers, bank logs, and committee votes that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. I slid the stack across Audrey's desk. She's the kind of lawyer whose stare can gut a room. Elegant blouse, pressed slacks, and a legal mind that had toppled 3 precincts for civil rights violations before she turned 40. She raised an eyebrow, read the first page, then looked up and said flatly, "You want justice or blood?" I didn't blink. Both. In that order. Within the week, we filed an official injunction against the Clarke Pavilion project. The letter we sent was laced with calm fury, a demand to halt all further construction, to unseal 15 years of land records, and to respond publicly or face full disclosure at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, where we planned to show every damning detail on a screen larger than any banner he could hang. There was no reply, but the next morning, I received an email from an untraceable address. No name, just one line. "You're playing with fire. Walk away before you burn." I smiled. Good. Fire's how you forge steel. I wasn't here to argue anymore. I was here to expose him. The groundwork was done, the evidence gathered, but let me ask you this. What happens when truth shows up? In front of cameras, reporters, and the very people who believed the lie? Stay with me, because this next moment, it changes everything. On the day of the Clarke Heritage Pavilion inauguration, the town gathered like it was a sacred holiday. Rows of white chairs lined the trimmed grass. Silk flowers hung from every arch, and a giant red ribbon glowed under the late morning sun. Clarke stood at the podium in a tailored gray suit, hand curled confidently around the microphone. His smile was perfectly rehearsed, sanctimonious, and self-assured, like a priest ready to bless his own altar. The local news crew streamed the entire spectacle live, panning slowly across the crowd. I stood quietly at the back, brim of my wide sun hat low enough to cloak my face. No one recognized me. Not yet. He began his speech with the syrupy cadence of a man who thought he'd won. This pavilion stands as a symbol of who we are, where we came from, and what we choose to preserve. But just as he raised the ceremonial scissors, ready to slice the ribbon and rewrite history in his name, a flicker of light burst from behind the stage. A portable projector hummed to life. The crowd turned. The stage dimmed. The screen filled with 3 words and that cut sharper than any blade. Whose history? Murmurs stirred like wind through dry leaves. Clarke hesitated, blinked. On the screen, a black and white photo emerged. Sycamore Hollow, 1940. Soldiers in formation, battle markers, flags. Then the image dissolved into the current aerial view of Clarke Plaza. Asphalt, parking lines, neon signage. A caption ran in bold across the screen. Same land, different story. People began to shift in their seats. A woman gasped softly and whispered, "That's my grandfather's unit. They camped there." And then came the second video. A montage of tampered land records, signed contracts from Civic Revive, audio clips from whistleblowers, a photo of Clarke, wineglass in hand, toasting developers at a private gala. My voice, calm and cold, narrated over every frame. They said they preserved our past, but they sold it piece by piece. Clarke tried to speak, to interrupt, but the microphones were already rerouted. My student media team had intercepted the broadcast feed. 2 side projectors activated, casting the same footage in giant clarity on both flanks of the stage. The truth could no longer be contained. An NBC reporter climbed the steps with purposeful stride, microphone aimed straight at Clarke. "Congressman Clarke, can you explain the connection between your LLC and the demolition of Sycamore Hollow?" His face drained of color. His lips fumbled for a sentence he hadn't rehearsed. "That information is clearly being manipulated." I stepped forward from the back, walking slowly to the front row. I raised a single photo high above the crowd. Clarke standing at Sycamore Hollow, smiling beside a construction stake, the protective landmark sign freshly torn down behind him. A ripple of slow clapping began from one corner. It grew, louder, sharper, until the applause twisted into angry chants. "Shame! Shame!" A rolled-up program hit the stage. A veteran's voice cracked above the noise. "My father bled on that land. You paved over his grave." Clarke's hand dropped to his side. The scissors hung loose between his fingers. He didn't just lose the crowd. He lost the narrative. You saw him crumble under truth, but did you think that was it? Oh no. The next part? That's where I turned his monument into a message he can't ever escape. A week after the unraveling at the Pavilion, the whole town felt like it had woken from a spell. The story had burst beyond our borders, spreading across the state like wildfire. Headlines framed Clarke as a disgraced figurehead who tried to sculpt his own legend from the ashes of our real history. Online, the hashtag #Clarke covered history trended for 3 straight days. Town council held an emergency session behind closed doors. Clarke didn't show up. The ribbon he never got to cut still hung limp on the temporary archway. And the project, indefinitely suspended, but I wasn't finished. While the world raged in real time, I moved quietly. The donation site, intended to fund future archival restoration, had reached nearly $100,000 in 72 hours. And with that, I made a purchase. Not the pavilion, not City Hall, just a forgotten sliver of land, 28 feet of patchy grass and cracked concrete, right beside the very monument Clarke built for his vanity. It was once part of Sycamore Hollow, now ignored and fenced like an afterthought. I didn't build a building. I built a reckoning. At the center of the lot, I planted a young oak tree, its roots eager, its branches trembling with promise. I commissioned a sculpture forged from reclaimed iron, the silhouette of an unnamed soldier, back bowed, planting a flag into the soil. Not a grand statue, not a plaque of names, just presence, just defiance. And in front of it, I mounted a weathered bronze plate. Its inscription was short, deliberate, and sharp enough to cut through all his polished speeches. This land held stories, not slogans. Remember that. But that was only the beginning. I had a custom-built digital board installed at the park's entrance, touchscreen enabled, solar-powered, always on. It played every frame of the exposé. The photos, the voiceovers, the signatures, the shaking hands of survivors. It looped endlessly, day and night, not as propaganda, as proof. And the board? It faced directly toward Clarke's second-floor office window, exactly 27 steps from the edge of the screen to his front door. On the morning it first powered up, I sat on the nearby bench with my coffee in hand, book open on my lap. I didn't look over. I didn't need to. I felt his eyes on me the moment he froze in the doorway, briefcase limp at his side, gaze locked on the moving images replaying his fall in relentless detail. When I finally glanced his way, I offered him nothing but a calm nod and turned the page. I didn't build a park, I built a reminder, and I placed it where he'd see it every single day. And while his world unraveled, I didn't just sit back. No, I planted something far stronger than revenge. You've seen the fight. Now let me show you what healing looks like when it's rooted in justice. They took my home, but not my roots. I didn't go back to my old apartment. That place held too many ghosts that whispered of what used to be. Instead, I asked for something quieter, something closer to the soil that had raised me. I signed up as a full-time volunteer at the local library, tucked behind ivy-covered bricks and nestled between rows of trees older than our mayor's lies. The library was one of the last places that hadn't been renovated into oblivion. Inside, it still smelled like time, aged pages and pencil shavings and dust that remembered things even when people didn't. Each morning, I made a cup of chamomile tea in a chipped porcelain mug, the kind with a tiny crack down the side I always turned away from. I'd sit at the corner desk, beneath the stained glass window, and open a leather-bound journal, brown and worn soft like my mother's hands. She used to write recipes in it. Now, I filled the pages with memories. The faces that once passed our porch. The sound of screen doors slamming in summer. The nights when the air carried nothing but the rhythm of cicadas and quiet breathing under shared quilts. No detail was too small. I wanted it all to live again. If not in wood and stone, then in ink and silence. On Saturdays, Jack would come by. My nephew, 10 years old and already suspicious of the world in a way that made me ache. He'd plop into the beanbag chair beside my desk, twirl a pencil between his fingers, and finally ask, "Why do you care so much about the past?" I never gave a long answer, just held up an old black and white photo of his grandfather, my father, standing proud in uniform outside Sycamore Hollow. The grass in that picture looked wild, uncut, defiant. I told Jack, because it's where you come from, and no one should take that without asking. Sometimes I think that's the only reason I didn't break, because I had someone younger to show the map to, someone who might still walk the paths they tried to bury. With a few college volunteers, I started organizing small trips, quiet pilgrimages really, for high school students to visit what remained of the town's forgotten sites. An old train depot with rusted tracks and shattered windows. A moss-covered well believed to date back to the founding settlers. A pale blue house with chipped shutters that once sheltered migrant families through the winters. I didn't dress it up. I didn't give them speeches. I just stood beside the ruins and let the stories speak. And each time, the kids listened. Not out of obligation, but reverence. Like standing beside a gravestone that bore their name. I wrote too. Not exposés or takedowns, those days were over. I wrote soft essays, sketches of memory printed in the Sunday edition of our local paper. Stories about corner stores that gave out popsicles on hot days. About the way rain used to sound on tin awnings before developers replaced them with silence. My first column was titled, "The Things Without Plaques." And for once, people read. They wrote back. They remembered. You've watched how I rebuilt from nothing. But have you ever wondered what happens to the man who lost everything? Don't blink. Because what comes next? It's the kind of downfall that no prison sentence could match. They say silence can be louder than 1,000 accusations. After the exposé, Congressman Everett Clarke didn't hold a press conference. He didn't issue a public apology or stage a tearful interview on local news. He disappeared. His office, once bustling with aides and photo ops, was shuttered for 3 straight days. The glass doors, once polished to a mirror sheen, were papered over with yellowed newspaper sheets, as if trying to hold back the storm of judgment outside. His name vanished from the town council's website, replaced by a single crimson line, under ethics review. And that, somehow, was the loudest statement of all. Rumors swirled like leaves in the wind. His wife had left town, moved back in with her sister across state lines. Their anniversary photo, once pinned proudly to her social media profile, had vanished. Someone mailed a typed letter to the town newspaper, unsigned but unmistakably personal. It read, "He used to say he was a living monument to this town, but he's become an exile in the history he tried to fake. I never saw him at ribbon cuttings anymore. No more tailored suits, no more lapel mics clipped to his collar, no more boastful handshakes after speeches about preserving the past." One morning, as I passed through Sycamore Park with a thermos of chamomile, I saw a hunched figure on one of the farther benches, tucked beneath the shade of the young oak. A baseball cap shadowed most of his face, but I recognized the tremble in his hand as he reached out to trace the engraved names on the war memorial. Not his, never his. He stared at that stone like it might absorb him if he wished hard enough. The townsfolk had renamed him behind his back. No longer Congressman Clarke, but Clarke the Cover-Up. Kids turned it into a game, pretending to pull down signs and collapse paper models of the pavilion. Their laughter echoed in the very place he tried to erase my family's memory. I walked by one day and caught a fragment of their chant, "Down with the fake." Even innocents knew the truth now. His Facebook, once brimming with speeches, holiday photos, community projects, had gone ghostly. The profile remained frozen in time, just his face beside the old bio. "Defender of our past." The top comment underneath asked, "Whose past exactly?" No reply ever came. One afternoon, passing by the cafe across from Town Hall, I paused when the barista leaned closer and whispered, "He comes here every morning now. Just sits by the window, doesn't order, doesn't speak, just watches." I nodded. That was enough. He was never arrested, never brought to trial. But he was convicted by something far more unrelenting. Memory. Not just mine, but the collective memory of every neighbor, every student who walked past the pavilion site and wondered why it now stood half-finished and hollow. Of every veteran who stopped by the park and saw that steel statue of an unknown soldier planting a flag, reminding them someone, somewhere, still cared about the truth. Sometimes I passed him in town. His shoulders hunched, his gaze always averted the moment he saw me. He never spoke, never acknowledged me, but he didn't need to. My presence and the quiet persistence of Sycamore Park was all the reckoning he'd ever receive. There were no confrontations, no dramatic showdowns. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point a finger. I simply existed. And that, it turned out, was enough to haunt him. He built his empire on a lie, and that lie eroded beneath his feet like sand under a rising tide. His legacy didn't need to be torn down brick by brick. It collapsed from within, hollowed by the weight of the truth he tried so hard to bury. The only monument he ever truly left behind was the echo of what he failed to protect, and so I never lifted a hand against him. I didn't have to ruin him. His legacy did that for me. His silence spoke louder than any apology. But this story doesn't end with shame. It ends with legacy. And if you've stayed with me this far, you'll want to hear what I left behind for the next generation. A year after the scandal, I stood on the same stage where Congressman Everett Clarke once thundered about heritage and progress. The town cultural festival had invited me as their keynote speaker. A quiet irony no one dared to acknowledge out loud. I didn't bring a stack of printed notes or a polished speech. Just a small, folded piece of paper with a photograph clipped to it. My childhood home, captured in a sun-faded snapshot, still bore the dark smudge of brick where my mother once placed her wood-fired stove. That image, quiet and unassuming, said more than I ever could. When I stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell into a hush that felt reverent. Not because of who I was, but because of what we had all been through together. I held the photo up and said only one sentence to begin. History is not what survives. It's what refuses to be forgotten. And then I told them a story, not about demolition or revenge, but about preservation, memory, and the power of ordinary people who refuse to let their roots be paved over. I used the settlement funds not to rebuild a house, but to build something deeper. I established the Sycamore Roots Foundation, a nonprofit that mentors young people in researching, documenting, and preserving untold local stories. Not the ones already bronzed on plaques or archived by institutions, but the ones whispered at kitchen tables and passed down through fading photo albums. Stories of coal makers, early immigrants, the Black and Latino families once housed in the southern part of town, an area that now appeared on city zoning maps with the sterile label Development Reserve. The local high school added a new course called Living History, written in part by me. Every week, students were assigned to interview an elder and retell one of their memories using sound recordings, hand-drawn illustrations, or oral storytelling. The results weren't always polished, but they were always human. A boy recreated his grandmother's account of arriving by train in 1947 using chalk on the sidewalk. A girl recorded her uncle describing a flood that washed through the West End in '62. Through them, I rediscovered something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Not naive hope, but the kind rooted in effort, in paying attention, in listening. A small independent press reached out and offered to publish a collection of my essays. They wanted to title it The Town Beneath the Pavement. I agreed, on one condition. All profits would go toward converting the abandoned train station into a civic archive and community hub. I didn't want royalties. I wanted a building where stories could outlive us. Most afternoons, I still walked to Sycamore Park. I'd bring my mother's old tin thermos, filled with chamomile and jasmine. I always poured 2 cups, one for me and one for whoever might need a place to rest and remember. Next to the bench stood a new stone marker, carved simply for those who remember when no one else would. Sometimes, someone sat beside me. Sometimes, no one did. But the second cup was never wasted. It was an invitation, a promise. I no longer dreamed of my old house. Those dreams, once filled with peeling wallpaper and warm firelight, had faded into something else, something lighter. Now, I dreamt of children standing in that same park, pointing to a plaque and telling stories not as visitors, but as keepers. Not reciting names from a textbook, but breathing life into them. I dreamt of them knowing that justice isn't always loud or immediate, but that it lives, waiting beneath the surface, ready to rise when someone dares to dig. Forgiveness didn't mean I had to inherit what was taken from me. That house, those walls, that garden, it was never about ownership. It was about meaning. And meaning, I've learned, is not a thing you lose to bulldozers. It's a thing you give away, piece by piece, by telling the truth. And truth, that's something we can pass down. So this is what I leave behind. Not bitterness, not anger, but a bench in a park, 2 warm cups, and a path forward lit by memory. They paved over my past. So I planted something that would outgrow them all. Thank you for staying until the end. If my story moved you, if it reminded you of your own roots or made you think about justice in a different light, please leave a comment below, like this video, and subscribe for more stories like this. Because some truths deserve to be told out loud.